In any asymmetric trade war, the smaller economy absorbs the hit and eventually folds. That's the textbook. When the United States levied sweeping tariffs on Canada, the expected outcome was compliance. Quiet concessions, a return to the status quo. What actually happened was the precise opposite. Canada began structurally decoupling, quietly, across multiple layers simultaneously. Because what this pressure revealed was something far more complicated and far more uncomfortable than simple resistance. Movement happening on both sides of the border at the same time. Over the next few minutes, I'll map that full cascade for you, from consumer boycotts to macro trade rerouting to the rewiring of national defense architecture, a framework I call the Structural Decoupling Cascade. And here's what will surprise you. The fracture didn't originate in Ottawa. It didn't originate in Washington. It started in grocery stores. In March 2020, American whiskey, bourbon, and vodka began vanishing from provincial shelves across Ontario, Quebec, Manitoba, and Nova Scotia. Not because of a supply chain disruption, because provincial liquor boards, responding to overwhelming public demand, pulled them deliberately. A market worth roughly $1 billion disrupted almost overnight. No legislation required. No trade tribunal convened. Consumers simply decided they were done. To understand why this happened so fast and so decisively, you need one concept from behavioral economics, psychological reactance. Here's the simplest way to think about it. Imagine someone walks up to you and says, "You are no longer allowed to choose where you eat lunch." Your first instinct isn't to negotiate. It's to walk straight to the restaurant they just told you to avoid and eat there twice. The restriction itself becomes the motivation. You're no longer running a rational cost-benefit calculation about food. You're defending your autonomy. The transaction has become an identity fight. That is exactly what unfolded at a national scale. When the United States imposed unilateral tariffs designed to force compliance, Canadians didn't weigh the economic trade-offs quietly and submit. The coercion activated a reactance response. A psychological reflex where perceived threats to freedom of choice triggered disproportionate, identity-driven resistance. And once resistance becomes about identity, it doesn't fade with a policy adjustment. It hardens. The data confirms this with uncomfortable precision. Post-escalation polling from The Guardian and Ipsos, conducted in June 2025, showed 64% of Canadians holding unfavorable views of the United States, with nearly 40% registering as very unfavorable. Angus Reid and Harris Poll surveys through August 2020 recorded widespread public readiness to support structural decoupling measures. By Canadians stopped being a slogan. It became a civic stance. And critically, this sentiment shift accomplished something politically irreversible. It lowered the cost for elected officials to back aggressive economic nationalism. When your electorate is already boycotting, you don't need courage to formalize the separation. You just need a pen. The financial consequences for American producers arrived immediately. According to the Discus 2025 American Spirits Exports Report, U.S. spirits exports to Canada plunged more than 70% year over year. By Q2 2025, the drop had deepened to 85%. In Ontario alone, roughly 80 million Canadian dollars worth of American spirits inventory sat warehoused and was deliberately not reordered. Provincial buyers didn't negotiate lower prices. They didn't seek alternative terms. They simply stopped calling. This is the mechanism most analysts underestimate. They treat consumer boycotts as emotional noise, temporary, irrational, easy to reverse once tensions cool. Psychological reactance is the opposite of noise. It is a structural rewiring of preference. Once a population collectively reframes a purchase decision from which product is cheapest to which product doesn't compromise who I am, the original seller's market access is temporarily suspended. It's revoked. And that revocation doesn't require a single new law. Consider what that means for the dominant economy's leverage. The entire theory behind coercive tariffs assumes the target population will pressure its own government to comply. When coercion triggers reactance instead, the population pressures its government in the opposite direction, toward deeper resistance. The tool designed to force submission becomes the accelerant for separation. And consumer sentiment, once it solidifies into purchasing patterns and provincial procurement decisions, doesn't simply reverse when a tariff is lifted. The shelf space is already reassigned. The supply contracts are already rewritten. The relationships are already severed. But what the corporate balance sheets are about to reveal is this. The psychological shift didn't stay confined to liquor stores and grocery aisles. It metastasized into earnings calls, cross-border supply chain audits, and quarterly revenue projections that American executives are only now beginning to fully absorb. The numbers arrived quietly, buried in a USTR trade summary that most people will never read. But they tell a story that no amount of political messaging can rewrite. In 2025, overall U.S.-Canada goods trade fell to an estimated $719.5 billion. That figure alone sounds abstract, so let's break it open. U.S. goods exports to Canada dropped 3.8%, a $13.4 billion contraction, pulling the total down to $336.5 billion. On the other side of the ledger, U.S. goods imports from Canada plunged even harder, 7.0% or $28.9 billion in absolute terms, landing at $383 billion. Pause on those two figures. $13.4 billion lost in American exports heading north, $28.9 billion lost in Canadian goods flowing south, combined over $42 billion in bilateral trade volume, evaporated in a single calendar year. And here's what makes this particularly devastating to the original strategy. The bleeding is symmetrical. This was supposed to be asymmetric pressure. The entire strategic premise, the foundational assumption, was that tariffs would function as a one-way lever. Apply force on one side, extract concessions, move on. But that assumption rests on a fundamental miscalculation that two economies generating over $700 billion in annual goods trade can be surgically separated at the joint without severing arteries on both sides. They can't. U.S. and Canadian supply chains are structurally fused at the molecular level. A single automotive part can cross that border up to 8 times before it reaches a finished vehicle on a dealership lot. Aluminum smelted in Quebec becomes aircraft skin in Kansas. Canadian potash feeds American agriculture from Iowa to Indiana. These are circulatory systems. Drop a tariff wall into the middle of a circulatory system, and what follows is a hemorrhage. That hemorrhage is bilateral by design. Every dollar of Canadian exports blocked at the border represents inputs that American manufacturers now have to source from somewhere else at higher cost with longer lead times through contracts that didn't exist 6 months ago. That $28.9 billion decline in Canadian goods flowing south didn't just punish Canadian exporters. It punched directly into American production costs, American delivery timelines, and American competitiveness. And this is the part that rarely makes headlines, but matters far more than the tariff rates themselves. The inflationary feedback loop, artificially severing deeply integrated supply chains, compounds costs at every node. Redundant sourcing, emergency logistics, renegotiated contracts at premium rates. Every new friction point becomes a price escalator, and those escalators feed directly into the consumer price index. Federal Reserve officials have had to confront this reality in real time. The supply chain disruptions generated by these tariffs represent a persistent, self-inflicted structural drag on monetary policy. You're attempting to cool inflation with interest rate tools while your own government's trade policy actively stokes input costs on the other side of the balance sheet. For central bankers tasked with maintaining price stability, this has become an impossible equation, one where the variables are working against each other by design, so the math speaks for itself. $13.4 billion in vanished export revenue, $28.9 billion in disrupted import flows, billions more in inflated domestic production costs that no tariff revenue can offset, and a Federal Reserve forced to navigate monetary terrain that Washington itself made deliberately harder to cross. But here's where most analyses stop, at the damage assessment. The losses, the write-downs, the quarterly earnings misses. If this were a conventional trade dispute, that might be enough. Tally the costs, wait for negotiations, assume the system eventually reverts to equilibrium. Except this system is showing no signs of reverting, because when you incinerate $42 billion out of a deeply integrated bilateral relationship, the capital doesn't simply vanish. It moves, it finds new corridors, new partners, new architectures entirely. And once those alternative pathways are built and operational, the cost of switching back becomes quietly, irreversibly prohibitive. So where did the capital go? The answer is already visible in the data, and it's far more systematic than most analysts initially projected. According to RBC Economics' April 2026 analysis, the share of Canadian merchandise exports destined for the United States fell from 75.9% in 2024 to roughly 71.6% to 72% by 2025. A 4 percentage point drop might sound modest in a headline. Applied across Canada's total export volume, that shift represents tens of billions of dollars in annual trade flow physically rerouted away from American buyers and toward new counterparties. But the annual flow is only the visible surface. Every rerouted trade corridor requires capital behind it. New port logistics, new warehousing contracts, new regulatory certifications, new distribution partnerships built from scratch. When Canadian firms committed to supplying EU and Indo-Pacific buyers at scale, they didn't just redirect shipments, they broke ground on processing facilities, signed multi-year offtake agreements, and locked capital into infrastructure with 10 and 15-year return horizons. Aggregate those commitments across sectors: energy, agriculture, advanced manufacturing, critical minerals, and the capital reallocation scales into the hundreds of billions over the coming decade. That is not a trade adjustment. That is the irreversible funding of a new multipolar commercial architecture, and every dollar sunk into it reduces the economic gravity pulling Canada back toward Washington. The destination side confirms the momentum. By January 2026, Statistics Canada recorded a 17% year-over-year surge in Canadian merchandise exports to non-US markets. 17% in a single year. That's the kind of acceleration you see when capital isn't exploring alternatives. It's committing to them. Here's the critical distinction. A reactive trade adjustment looks like a company finding a temporary buyer while waiting for tariffs to normalize. What Canada executed was categorically different. Entire supply chains were structurally reallocated toward the European Union and the Indo-Pacific. By October 2025, Canada's non-US goods exports hit a record $21.5 billion in a single month, according to Statistics Canada. That number represents new contracts, new logistics infrastructure, new regulatory alignments, all of which carry switching costs that make reversal economically irrational. This is permanent macroeconomic migration. The architecture has been built, the relationships have been formalized, and every month those alternative corridors operate, the cost of returning to the old US-centric model compounds. But the most strategically consequential layer of this diversification operates beneath traditional macroeconomic models. In an asset class, the market structurally underprices critical minerals. Canada sits on one of the world's largest reserves of lithium, cobalt, nickel, and rare earth elements, the exact inputs that power electric vehicles, semiconductor fabrication, advanced weapon systems, and satellite infrastructure. For decades, the extraction and processing of these resources moved at a pace dictated largely by American industrial demand. That arrangement quietly ended. in 2025, the Canadian government enacted what it called the Build, Partner, Buy, Defense Industrial Strategy. The framework was designed to accomplish three things simultaneously: accelerate domestic mining and processing capacity, particularly in British Columbia, secure bilateral supply agreements with allied nations, and vertically integrate Canadian critical mineral output into allied defense manufacturing pipelines. This convergence wasn't circumstantial. As U.S. tariffs disrupted traditional export flows, Ottawa fast-tracked permitting for critical minerals projects specifically to absorb the shock. But absorbing turned into something far more ambitious. Those same assets, Canadian lithium, Canadian cobalt, Canadian rare earths, are now being rapidly folded into the European Union's €800 billion defense procurement plan. Canada didn't just find a new customer, it repositioned itself as an indispensable supply node in the defense architecture of an entirely separate geopolitical bloc. The EU needs secure, non-Chinese, non-Russian sources for the minerals that underpin its military modernization. Canada, stable, democratic, resource-rich, and now actively seeking diversification, became the obvious partner. This is the inflection point where Canada shifted from a dependent ally orbiting a single hegemon to an independent middle power node with structural leverage across multiple power centers. The critical minerals play alone gives Ottawa bargaining power it simply did not possess 5 years ago. When your lithium goes into European fighter jet batteries and your cobalt feeds South Korean semiconductor fabs, you are no longer a junior partner waiting for favorable terms from Washington. You are a sovereign supplier with optionality, and every mine that comes online, every processing facility that reaches capacity, every long-term offtake agreement signed with Berlin or Tokyo or Seoul, that's another strand of the old dependency architecture permanently severed. So the structural decoupling cascade has now reached its third layer. Consumer rejection rewired the psychology. Trade hemorrhaging fractured the economic plumbing. And proactive diversification is rebuilding the entire commercial and industrial foundation on a multipolar base. But here's what keeps strategic planners awake at 3 a.m. You can diversify every trade route on the map. You can sign mineral agreements with every allied nation on Earth. None of it holds, none of it, if the deepest layer of national infrastructure remains compromised. And that layer isn't trade, it isn't minerals, it's the architecture that controls your military operations and your citizens' most sensitive data. That's where the story takes its sharpest turn. In April 2026, what had begun as a dispute over steel tariffs and bourbon shelf space crossed a threshold that no trade negotiation could walk back. The erosion of trust. The same force that emptied American whiskey from Canadian shelves, the same force that redirected billions in trade toward Europe and the Indo-Pacific. Olika halbian talihahitset migrated into the single most sensitive domain two allied nations can share, national defense. And the crisis didn't surface as a disagreement over weapons platforms or procurement budgets. It surfaced as a question about data. Here's the structural reality. A modern fighter jet costing tens of millions per unit functions as a data ecosystem first, airframe second. Every mission generates targeting coordinates, sensor fusion outputs, electronic warfare signatures, classified operational patterns, a continuous stream of raw strategic intelligence that defines a nation's actual defense posture. The airframe is the body. That data is the brain. For decades, Canada's defense architecture operated on the assumption that sharing this brain with the United States was strategically optimal. Interoperability with the American military-industrial complex was treated as a feature, never a vulnerability. That assumption fractured the moment Canada's strategic planners examined the fine print of the Lockheed Martin F-35 program. According to CBC News analysis from April 2026, the F-35's entire operational payload, every byte, must be stored and processed through integrated infrastructure located in Fort Worth, Texas. Not Ottawa, not Montreal, Fort Worth. Now layer on a single piece of legislation, the United States Cloud Act of 2018. This law legally permits U.S. authorities to compel access to data stored by American companies or on American-linked infrastructure, regardless of where that data physically resides. Combine the F-35's data architecture with the Cloud Act, and you reach a conclusion that should make any sovereign nation pause. The full intelligence output of Canadian combat operations, technically accessible to a foreign government through its own domestic law. Pause here. Examine the architecture. Hardware interoperability without data sovereignty is not an alliance. It is a structural dependency with a kill switch someone else controls. If you outsource the operational brain of your defense network, then every diversified trade route, every mineral agreement, every carefully negotiated partnership you've built becomes strategically irrelevant the moment that switch gets flipped. Because at the deepest layer, you don't own your own defense posture. But abandoning the F-35 is not a decision any defense planner makes lightly. The F-35 is the dominant combat aircraft among NATO-aligned air forces, the emerging standard around which allied joint operations, shared logistics networks, training pipelines, and parts supply chains are being consolidated. Walking away from that platform means walking away from the single largest interoperability framework in Western defense. It means Canadian pilots can no longer plug seamlessly into coalition operations built around F-35 fleet architecture. It means accepting a degree of operational isolation from the hardware ecosystem your closest allies are standardizing on at exactly the moment when coordinated deterrence matters most. That is the weight of what Canada chose to sacrifice. And it is precisely what makes the next move so revealing. When Canada drew its red line, the alternative came from an unexpected direction. In April 2026, Saab, the Swedish defense manufacturer, formally proposed a package to the Canadian government: 72 Gripen E F-fighter jets and 6 GlobalEye airborne early warning aircraft. Competitive hardware, certainly. But the proposal contained something no American contractor could structurally offer: a sovereign data center, purpose-built in Montreal, designed exclusively to host all mission-critical intelligence generated by Canadian operations. Stored on Canadian soil, governed by Canadian law, shielded entirely from extraterritorial access. Montreal, not Fort Worth. The question, as one strategic assessment framed it, is no longer only about technical safeguards. It is about the fundamental structure of control and whether reliance on external systems introduces vulnerabilities that could become more significant over time. This is where the structural decoupling cascade reached its apex. Trace the sequence: a consumer boycott of American whiskey, a redirection of billions in bilateral trade, a reconstruction of critical mineral supply chains. And now, the deliberate architectural separation of national defense data from American jurisdiction, from a bottle of wine pulled off a shelf in Toronto to a sovereign data vault under construction in Montreal. That is the distance this cascade has traveled. And every step followed the same underlying logic. When coercive pressure meets a sovereign nation, the response doesn't stay contained. It propagates through every layer of dependency until it reaches the foundation. And then it rewrites the foundation itself. When it comes to national defense in the 21st century, which do you believe is the greater risk, losing physical interoperability with your closest neighbor, or handing over the keys to your sovereign data? Let me know your read on this down below. The cascade has reached the highest level of national architecture. But what does this restructured landscape actually look like when you pull the camera all the way back? When you assess the full operating picture of a Canada that has systematically untethered itself from its deepest economic, industrial, and military integration with the United States, that is exactly where we're headed. Here's the full operating picture. What began as a psychological flinch at the consumer level, millions of individual purchasing decisions quietly redirecting away from American goods, escalated into a macroeconomic hemorrhage, billions in trade flows permanently rerouted toward Europe, Asia Pacific, and domestic alternatives. That commercial realignment exposed the brittle foundations of industrial dependency, accelerating diversification across energy, critical minerals, and supply chains. And at the apex of this cascade, Canada drew its hardest line, a sovereign data red line in national defense, choosing architectural independence over decades of military integration. This is the Structural Decoupling Cascade. 4 layers, each triggered by the layer beneath it, each more difficult to reverse than the last. And here is the strategic truth most commentators still fail to articulate. Asymmetric economic coercion against an allied nation triggers structural immune responses, institutional, commercial, and military antibodies that compound with every escalation. The tariffs were designed as discipline. They functioned as the single most effective catalyst for Canadian structural independence in a generation, inadvertently engineering a competitor with diversified trade relationships, sovereign industrial capacity, and autonomous defense architecture. If you're still analyzing this through a trade surplus ledger, who gained a few points in aluminum, who lost a margin in lumber, you're watching the scoreboard of a game that already ended. The real contest has moved to a fundamentally different arena, the irreversible redistribution of structural dependency itself. Carry this framework forward, the structural decoupling cascade applies far beyond this particular bilateral relationship. It describes the predictable, repeatable consequence of weaponizing economic interdependence against any sovereign actor with the institutional capacity to respond. Learn to spot asymmetric dependency risks in your own professional landscape, in supply chains, in partnerships, in strategic assumptions that feel permanent until they suddenly aren't. If this is how you prefer to understand what's actually reshaping the global order, subscribe. The next structural shift is already underway, and we'll be mapping it before the headlines catch up.